It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day where the sun hung lazily in the sky, and the streets were surprisingly clear for a Friday. I had just finished a long shift at the courthouse and was driving home in my old car, enjoying the peacefulness of the moment. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, just the usual commute. But as I made a left turn down Main Street, I noticed the flashing lights in my rearview mirror. I sighed, thinking it was just some random check. I was an elderly woman, after all, but I knew my rights. I pulled over and kept my hands on the steering wheel, just as I had been taught in driving school all those years ago. I watched as a young officer approached my car, his uniform neat but his expression unreadable. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the officer said as he bent slightly to peer inside the car. "Afternoon," I replied, giving him a polite smile. "Is there a problem, officer?" "License and registration, please," he said, his tone already tense. I complied, handing over the documents. He looked them over quickly, his brow furrowing slightly. "Can I ask why you were speeding, ma'am?" I raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't speeding." "Well, the radar shows you were going a few miles over the limit." "You didn't see that?" He gestured toward the road ahead, then back at me, his eyes narrowing a little. I took a deep breath. I wasn't going to let some mistake ruin my day, especially not after everything I'd worked for. "I wasn't speeding, officer." "You must be mistaken." His eyes shifted to the license in his hand, and I could see him processing it in his head. "Says here you're Mrs. Clara Johnson. No prior offenses." He trailed off as he glanced up from the card, as though looking for a reason to dig deeper. He couldn't possibly know who I was. But I knew better than to reveal too much too soon. I wasn't some naive citizen unaware of the politics at play. The officer was still standing at my door, his body tense, ready for a confrontation that, to me, seemed entirely unnecessary. I wondered if he'd ever suspected he was talking to someone who had the power to shape the laws he swore to uphold. The officer hesitated, still holding my driver's license, as if trying to decide whether to run a background check or just let me go. The way he studied my details felt almost suspicious. His face betrayed a hint of confusion, like he was piecing something together but wasn't sure what exactly. "Mrs. Johnson," he said slowly, looking back at me. "I see you've been in this town for quite a while. Do you happen to know why I pulled you over?" I nodded, keeping my composure. "As I mentioned, officer, I wasn't speeding. Maybe the radar's malfunctioning." I could feel the shift in the air, this wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. Something was off. He was still staring at my license, his gaze flickering between the document and me, clearly trying to figure out if he should do something more. Finally, he shook his head and let out a small sigh, like he was starting to lose interest in the whole matter. But before he could say anything else, another car pulled up beside us, a marked police cruiser. A second officer stepped out, and I noticed his eyes immediately darted to my car, studying the situation closely. "Everything okay, Tyler?" The new officer asked, his voice calm, as though he'd seen 100 traffic stops before this one. Tyler, the young officer, nodded, but I noticed his hesitation. He seemed almost unsure about what to do next. "Yeah, just running the details on this woman. Something feels off, but I can't put my finger on it." The new officer stepped closer, looking down at my documents. "Let's just wrap this up, all right? You've been through a lot, Mrs. Johnson?" he asked, his tone slightly more respectful now, probably because he sensed something that Tyler hadn't yet realized. I held back a small chuckle, a mixture of amusement and frustration. "I've been through more than you could imagine. I'm not the one you need to be questioning here." The officer's face tightened. "What do you mean?" "You'll see soon enough." I knew the moment had come to remind them. "I'm Clara Johnson," I said with quiet authority. "And I sit on the Supreme Court of the United States." There was a brief silence that followed my words, hanging in the air like thick fog. The second officer blinked twice, his expression changing from skepticism to confusion, then to a quick realization. His eyes widened, and his lips parted slightly as if trying to find the right words but failing. Tyler, however, looked completely stunned. He glanced at the second officer, his face turning pale as if he had just realized the magnitude of his mistake. "Wait, you're a Supreme Court justice?" His voice cracked, the disbelief evident. I nodded slowly, keeping my posture straight and my tone even. "I am Justice Clara Johnson. And I expect to be treated with the same respect that anyone else in my position would be." I wasn't going to make excuses or soften the situation. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore, this was about their understanding of the law, respect, and authority. Tyler's face flushed with embarrassment, and he quickly stuffed my license and registration back into his hand, fumbling. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't realize. You didn't seem like," he trailed off, clearly kicking himself for his poor judgment. "Clearly," I said dryly, my patience wearing thin. The second officer, now visibly flustered, placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder, signaling him to step back. He turned toward me, his voice softer, almost apologetic. "Justice Johnson, we didn't mean any disrespect. This isn't how we normally handle things. We just wanted to make sure there weren't any issues." "Of course," I replied, my voice cold but measured. "But I assure you, this is not the way to handle a simple traffic stop either. You've embarrassed yourself and your department." Tyler looked down, avoiding my gaze, his hand twitching nervously at his side. It was clear he had never imagined he'd be in this situation, questioning a Supreme Court justice in the middle of a suburban street, no less. I could see the second officer trying to salvage the situation. "I'll make sure everything's cleared up right now, ma'am. You can go. No ticket. I'll let our supervisor know what happened here, and this won't happen again." I gave him a curt nod, my hand still gripping the steering wheel. "I'll be sending a report to your precinct. This is unacceptable." With that, the officers took a few steps back. Tyler remained frozen, his face still a shade of crimson, while the second officer walked away to make the necessary calls. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on me. This was more than just a minor inconvenience. It was a reminder of how much work was left to be done. Even those who swore to uphold the law still had a lot to learn about it. I started the engine, ready to drive away from the scene, but not without leaving a parting thought. "And next time, officer," I called out to Tyler, who was still staring at me from a distance, "don't let appearances fool you. There's more to people than what you see." I drove off, leaving the officers standing there, realizing just how close they had come to crossing a line that neither of them would soon forget. As I made my way down the road, the tension of the stop began to fade, but the reality of what had just happened lingered in my mind. It wasn't just the embarrassing incident, it was the fact that Tyler hadn't recognized me, or worse, hadn't even considered who I might be. A Supreme Court justice, someone whose decisions shaped the very laws he was supposed to uphold, and yet, here I was, being treated like just another driver caught in a routine traffic stop. I couldn't help but feel a small pang of frustration. The assumption that I was just another old lady behind the wheel wasn't something I often encountered, not anymore, not in my position. But it was clear that Tyler had underestimated me, and not for the first time in my career, I was reminded of how easy it was for some people to make snap judgments based on appearances alone. The sun was starting to set as I neared my home, the warm glow spilling over the horizon. I pulled into my driveway, the peace of my surroundings offering a brief reprieve from the chaos of the day. But even as I parked the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I knew the officers would be talking about the encounter long after I had gone. I grabbed my purse from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, but before I could reach the door, I heard the familiar hum of a car approaching. I turned to see the second officer, the one who had apologized, pulling up slowly behind me. He stopped just at the edge of my driveway, his car's headlights illuminating the front yard. I paused, watching him cautiously. Was this some kind of follow-up? Or was he here to smooth things over again? He rolled down his window, and I could see his nervous expression. Justice Johnson, I just wanted to say, again, how sorry we are for what happened today. I've already called our supervisor. We'll be handling it internally. I raised an eyebrow, considering his words carefully. And what, exactly, will be handled internally? The entire incident. Your report, the way we handled the situation, it's all being reviewed. This isn't going to reflect well on our precinct, and we know that. We're committed to doing better. His voice was sincere, but I could see the unease still present in his eyes. He wasn't just apologizing to avoid trouble, he was genuinely trying to make amends. I nodded slowly, not quite ready to forgive just yet, but willing to listen. I appreciate you taking responsibility. But there's a bigger issue here, isn't there? This isn't just about what happened today, it's about a systemic problem. If this had happened to someone else, someone who didn't have the standing to correct you, who would have stood up for them? His face darkened, and he shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with where the conversation was going. I understand that. And you're right. I'll be taking this lesson with me, ma'am. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. I stared at him for a moment longer, weighing my options. I wasn't one to hold grudges, but I also wasn't one to let an opportunity pass by when it came to making real change. Good, I said finally, my tone firm but not unkind. But don't just make promises to me. Make them to everyone who's ever been stopped like this. It's time for a change. With that, I turned and walked to my door, leaving him standing there with nothing more to say. He'd learned his lesson, I hoped. But the real question was, would he take it beyond this one interaction? The evening passed quietly, the kind of stillness that follows an intense moment. I spent the next few hours settling into my routine, finishing some paperwork that had piled up on my desk, but my thoughts kept returning to the traffic stop. I had dealt with countless situations over the years, cases, injustices, and long nights spent in deliberation, but this was different. It was personal. The next morning, I found myself at my desk early, sipping a cup of tea while I skimmed through a few briefs that had been sent over. The phone rang, breaking the silence of my office. I picked it up without hesitation. Justice Johnson, I said, my voice calm and collected. Good morning, ma'am, came the voice on the other end. It was the officer from yesterday, the second one, the one who had apologized. I just wanted to let you know that everything's been taken care of on our end. My supervisor has reviewed the situation, and the department is implementing some additional training. We're addressing not only the incident itself but also a larger conversation about how we engage with civilians. I wanted you to hear it directly from me. I paused, considering his words carefully. I appreciate you calling. But I hope this isn't just about making the department look good. I need to know that this is part of a real shift in how things are done. It is, he replied without hesitation. We're taking a hard look at the culture within the department. This was a wake-up call for all of us. I'm sorry again, ma'am. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the bustling city below. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being the one to remind law enforcement about respect and authority, yet it had taken a simple traffic stop for them to realize the importance of both. You've done the right thing by reaching out, I said. But this isn't just about apologies. This is about making sure that when you pull someone over, you don't make assumptions based on their age, their gender, or the color of their skin. Everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are. Now, it's up to you to ensure that change is more than just words. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then he responded with quiet resolve. I understand, ma'am. We'll do better. I'll make sure it's not just talk. Thank you for giving us this chance. The call ended shortly after, and I sat there for a few moments, reflecting on everything. This wasn't the resolution I had expected when I first started my career, but it was the reality. Sometimes, change came slowly, but it was possible. It was in moments like this, unexpected, awkward, but ultimately meaningful, that I could see that the seeds of progress were being sown. I put the phone down and turned back to my work, my mind already moving on to the next case. There was always more to be done. But for once, it felt like maybe, just maybe, something had shifted for the better. Days passed after the phone call, and while the incident from the traffic stop had somewhat faded from my mind, I couldn't ignore the ripple it created. I knew that it had sparked a broader conversation within the police department, but what I didn't know was just how much of an impact it would have. Sometimes, the most unexpected events create the most lasting changes. Then came the letter. It arrived on my desk one morning, nestled among the usual pile of case briefs and legal correspondence. It was simple, unmarked except for my name, written in formal script. I opened it carefully, curiosity piquing my interest. The letter was from the Chief of Police himself. Dear Justice Johnson, I want to personally thank you for your patience and your thoughtful approach in the wake of the incident with Officer Tyler and myself. We have taken your concerns to heart. As a result, our department has launched an internal review of our training policies, particularly regarding interactions with civilians, and the assumptions that officers may unknowingly make. I've also reached out to several community organizations to begin conversations about how we can improve public trust and engagement. While I deeply regret the initial incident, I am grateful that you brought these issues to light in such a constructive way. Your feedback has been invaluable in beginning a much-needed shift within our department. It is my hope that we can continue to earn your trust and demonstrate our commitment to meaningful change. Respectfully, Chief Robert Hayes City Police Department. I sat there, staring at the letter in my hand, letting the words sink in. It wasn't the usual letter of apology I was accustomed to receiving. It was different. Genuine. It spoke to real action, not just promises, and that, I realized, was something I hadn't expected. I placed the letter down on my desk, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel a small sense of pride. Change wasn't always immediate or even easy. But sometimes, all it took was one moment, a single interaction, to start a conversation that could lead to something greater. The phone rang again just as I was about to get back to my work. It was the officer from the traffic stop, Tyler. His voice, now more confident and clear, came through the receiver. Justice Johnson, I just wanted to let you know that I've been doing a lot of reading and reflecting over the past few days. I realize that the issue isn't just about following the law, it's about understanding why the law exists in the first place and how we apply it in a way that respects people's dignity. I'm committed to learning more and doing better moving forward. I just wanted you to know that. His words struck me. I hadn't expected such sincerity from the young officer, but his change in tone was unmistakable. It was clear that the encounter had left an impact on him, one he wasn't simply brushing aside. I'm glad to hear that, Officer Tyler, I replied, my voice firm but warm. Remember, the law isn't just about enforcement. It's about fairness. And it's up to people like you to make sure it's carried out with integrity. I will, ma'am, he said. Thank you again. The conversation ended, and I leaned back in my chair, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. There was no guarantee that the department would change overnight, or that every officer would internalize the lessons they were being taught. But for the first time in a long while, I felt that change was possible. It was a slow process, but it was happening. I looked out the window again, the city now alive with motion below me. The journey was far from over, but it was moving in the right direction. Weeks passed since the traffic stop, and the city seemed to buzz with new energy. I noticed it in the conversations at the courthouse, in the conversations around town, and even in the news. There were murmurs of change, whispers of real reform. The police department was being watched, not just by the public, but also by their own officers, who now seemed more aware of the impact their actions could have. I was still processing it all. The incident, the conversations, the apologies, and, most importantly, the action. It was hard to ignore how different things felt, how much more deliberate everything seemed. The small, everyday conversations about policing had become louder and more direct, and for once, it didn't feel like a conversation just for show. But I also knew that words, no matter how well-meaning, were never enough. Action had to follow. I needed to know that this change wasn't just a passing moment, a temporary shift of focus. I needed to see that this wasn't some carefully orchestrated public relations move designed to quell the noise. Then, one afternoon, I received another unexpected phone call. "Justice Johnson," came the voice, this time belonging to Chief Hayes himself. "I know we've been in touch about the reforms, but I wanted to personally invite you to a meeting. We're forming a community advisory board to work with the department. The goal is to create ongoing dialogue and ensure the changes we've discussed are sustainable. We'd be honored if you could join us." I sat in silence for a moment, letting the offer sink in. It was one thing to make promises, it was another to invite those who held the system accountable to help guide it forward. "That's a very generous offer, Chief Hayes," I said, my voice thoughtful. "But I have to ask, what makes you believe the changes will stick this time? How can I trust that this isn't just another moment of talk?" "I understand your hesitation, Justice Johnson." "Believe me, I do," he said, his voice steady. "But the difference now is that the officers themselves are on board. The training we've implemented isn't just a one-off session. It's a continuous effort. We've seen a shift, and this board will help us make sure we stay on track. We're committed to transparency and accountability." His words were convincing, but still, I had to remind myself that trust wasn't given, it had to be earned. The real test would be what happened next, after the cameras were turned off and the media moved on. Would the police department continue the hard work of change? "I'll consider your invitation," I replied, my tone neutral but not dismissive. "But I expect results. Not just talk. The real work begins when the public isn't watching." "I understand," Chief Hayes said, his voice resolute. "We're in this for the long haul. And I'd like you to be a part of that." I hung up the phone, leaning back in my chair. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. This wasn't just about one mistake. This was bigger. It was about a system, a culture that needed to change. The path forward wasn't clear, but it was there, and it was worth taking. I couldn't be the one to fix everything, but I could be a part of it. And sometimes, that's all it takes, a little push, a little nudge, and a willingness to keep moving forward, no matter how daunting the road may seem. The invitation to join the Community Advisory Board weighed on my mind for days. It felt like the right move, but at the same time, it was a commitment I knew would require more than just my time, it would demand my energy, my focus, and, perhaps, my faith in a system that had often let people like me down. But after much thought, I accepted. The first meeting was a revelation. The room was filled with a diverse group of people, local activists, community leaders, and even a few former officers who had left the force, frustrated by the very system they had sworn to protect. As I looked around the table, I realized something had already shifted. This wasn't a group of people trying to maintain the status quo. These were individuals determined to reshape the system, not just for the betterment of their community, but for the integrity of the law itself. Chief Hayes was there, along with the officers who had been involved in the traffic stop. They were no longer just speaking to appease us, they were actively participating, genuinely listening, and taking notes. It was clear that they understood the magnitude of what was at stake. This wasn't just about one department or one city. It was about changing the way law enforcement interacted with the people they served, making sure that respect wasn't just a word, but a practice that began with the officers themselves. Over the course of several months, we worked tirelessly, reviewing policies, revising training programs, and meeting with community members to ensure that the changes weren't just theoretical. They were real, tangible steps forward. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks. But with each step, I could see the commitment in the officer's eyes, and that made all the difference. Tyler, the young officer who had been involved in my traffic stop, was one of the first to make real progress. I watched as he took responsibility, grew into his role, and became a force for positive change within the department. He wasn't just an officer anymore, he was a mentor to others, guiding them through the difficult conversations about race, bias, and the law. One day, a few months after the board had been established, I walked into the precinct for a meeting with Chief Hayes and the officers. I'd been busy with the usual workload, but there was something about this visit that felt different, something that felt right. As I entered the room, Tyler stood up and greeted me with a firm handshake. "Justice Johnson," he said, a slight grin on his face. "We're making progress. It's not perfect, but we're getting there. I just wanted to thank you again, for everything." I nodded, my gaze scanning the room. The changes weren't perfect, but they were real. And that, in itself, was a victory. "We've all got a long road ahead of us," I said, my voice firm but hopeful. "But if we're all committed, there's nothing we can't change." And as I left that room, I felt it, something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Change was no longer a distant dream. It was happening. And I, Justice Clara Johnson, was proud to have played a small part in it.